And welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Still Curtain podcast. I'm your host, Tommy Jaggi, editor of StillCurtain.com. And joining me, as always, is Still Curtain contributor Shayne Kubas. Shayne and I were off last week. I got to enjoy a week down in the sun in Florida and come back to weather that was reaching below zero up here,
Yeah,
Shayne. So not very fun.
not so great. Yeah, it's big difference going from up here in PA down to Florida. So
We're going to talk about the latest rumors swirling around the Steelers today. We're going to break down the updated quarterback options, what's realistic. Nothing matters more than that. We've talked about it before, but we're going to hammer it again because we want to see what is out there, every potential option. We're also going to give our way too early predictions for the Steelers with the 21st overall pick in the draft this year, assuming they stay at that spot. But what they could potentially do in the first round, and we'll see. Well, maybe come back and check on this to see if any of our predictions were correct here. We're going to break down those top 5 candidates for me and for Shayne, and we'll see if we can nail those down. Let's start with this, though, Shayne, and I hate to even talk about this.
yeah,
You know how much I hate this.
yeah, me
But
too.
Daniel Jones is being linked to the Pittsburgh Steelers.
Yeah,
Comes from Andrew Filipponi.
which gives me
And
hope. No offense to Andrew, but it gives me hope that maybe this isn't a big deal.
understand. So he hits some and he misses some, but
Yeah.
he talked about it first yesterday, claiming that a source essentially said that this could be a potential Steelers fit. Let's see, I've got that quote up here somewhere. But he doubled down today because Mark Schlereth was talking about it, and so Filipponi again said something to the tune of there could be some truth to this. Shayne, first of all, how would you feel about Daniel Jones as the Steelers quarterback for the 2025 season? And do you think that this is potentially something that's in the works? You're talking about him as a starting quarterback for this team.
As a starter, I'm very firmly out on Daniel Jones with any team, definitely mine included here in this case. He just simply doesn't have it as a starter, in my opinion, for a multitude of reasons that we could get into. But it's probably, it's been talked to death at this point, why he shouldn't be a starting quarterback. But I think as a backup, I would entertain it because he at least has some of the traits that you look for in the scheme where he's able to boot out. He's a good athlete, especially in the straight line. Like, he can do some of that type of stuff. Like, he can throw the ball off play action pretty well, considering, especially compared to his other attributes. Like, there's a schematic fit there that does make sense. It's just that he's just simply not a starting caliber player, in my opinion, frankly. So that's just the biggest hang up for him.
Yeah, before I get any deeper in the weeds here is the quote. So Andrew Filipponi on X yesterday said there's interest from former Giants quarterback Daniel Jones inside the Steelers organization. From his source, said the Steelers could do a lot worse than Jones, with the belief that it could actually be a good fit in Arthur Smith's offense. Kind of as you alluded to, Shayne, he reiterated that today, quoting the Breakfast Ball podcast, Mark Schlereth, and said, ball knower Mark Schlereth explains why the Steelers and Arthur Smith would see potential in Daniel Jones. I'm telling you, it could happen. Schematically, it does make some sense, right? Because Arthur Smith's the most success he had came with Ryan Tannehill, who was a similar profile type of quarterback, a taller quarterback, more straight liney speed, not really an elusive player within the pocket, but one that can at least have the willingness to throw the ball over the middle of the field, can see over the offensive line. Very, very different than what we experienced with both Justin Fields and Russell Wilson, who are different from each other even. But schematically, I do think Daniel Jones makes more sense than either Fields or Wilson. The problem that I have is I just don't think Daniel Jones is good, Shayne. Like, now we have a 2-year sample. You have to go back to 2022. And over these past 2 seasons, when Daniel Jones has played 16 games, he has led his team to a 3-13 record. Again, it's a team stat, but quarterbacks are largely responsible for that. 10 passing touchdowns during that time, 13 interceptions, 5.62 adjusted yards per attempt. That is an abysmal number. That it's like, these are we're talking like worse than Kenny Pickett level.
I was about to say, like, we're outside of the wins and losses. It sounds a whole lot like a quarterback we had recently, statistically speaking. Yeah. But that's the point. Like you said, like it comes down to, like, yes, if he's looking for a place to rebuild his career and to kind of be in a scheme that makes sense for him if he has to play, the Steelers wouldn't be a bad option for him specifically. But as a starter, it's a non-starter actually for me. Like I just can't really buy into him starting games for this team on purpose. Like if as a backup, he has to come in. He has experience, had decent games in his career. He's had a decent season in 2022, like you talked about. That got him paid entirely too much money, but he still had a good season. It just, again, I think we're past the point of considering him as a starter because this isn't like a Sam Darnold situation or, even honestly, the Justin Fields situation where the traits are just so good that in the right situation, he could potentially become a really good starter. I don't think Jones is in that category as like a reclamation project type.
Yeah, Shayne, and the Giants paid Daniel Jones a 4-year, $160 million contract, $40 million per year during the 2023 offseason. They had him for a year and change. It cut him this season, and that was the end of it. And so they were willing to eat dead money just to be done with the Daniel Jones experiment at this point. Obviously, maybe that had something more to do with even just trying to tank essentially and get a high draft pick.
Right.
But what people will point to, Shayne, is Sam Darnold. Sam Darnold had 7 years into his career, which is what Daniel Jones is going to be this year, 7 years into his career, had just this resurgent season, this journeyman quarterback, former first-round pick, the Jets couldn't get anything out of him, the Panthers couldn't, the 49ers couldn't, and he goes to the Vikings, where he has a 35-touchdown, 4,000-yard season. So are the Steelers now kind of going to buy into that mentality? It's like, well, if Sam Darnold did it, maybe Daniel Jones could, who kind of fits that similar profile. He's a scheme fit for us. If you were bringing in Daniel Jones to be a backup quarterback, sign me up. You could do far worse. But if he is going to be your starter for a 17-game season in Pittsburgh, how do you think that would end, Shayne? Because I see that resulting in a 7 to 9 win season for the Steelers, maybe a 10-win season, and maybe he's better just scheme-wise than these last couple quarterbacks, where I just don't think he can make enough plays to win enough games.
I think the problem with him is he would be the guy that could test. Like if Tomlin really wants to find out if he's capable of having a losing season, that's a good way to find out. Because the problem with Daniel Jones ultimately is that he just is too lackadaisical with the football, both as a passer and as a runner. This is a guy who just takes massive hits in the pocket because he doesn't have any pocket presence whatsoever. He is a guy that will put the ball in harm's way. He just simply will do it. And when he isn't doing it, he has no ability to push the ball down the field then because he's too afraid to make mistakes. It is the ultimate combination of a guy who wants to be a gunslinger but is not capable of being one. And so he flip-flops between trying these throws that he just simply can't make and not even attempting any major throws at all. So you get the worst of both kind of with him sometimes. So to me, it's the exact opposite of, especially as a passer, than what I think they're wanting to get out of the quarterback position. And that's why even if the scheme fit sort of makes sense, I'm skeptical that they view him as anything more than maybe, and this is like an absolute last choice such situation, somebody who can at least start games for you because you ran out of other options, but more so as a backup. I could totally believe the backup situation being the case.
Yeah, and you talked about just being brain dead in the pocket. Not a good trait to have if Myles Garrett were to stick around. Trey Hendrickson's in the division, the NFL's leading sack leader from this past season. So just not a lot to get excited about. And again, when you're talking about a player who is 6 years into their NFL career, going into year 7, hope of that player turning things around, very, very slim. And we've seen one of the rare examples of that with Sam Darnold this past season. So maybe that gives the Steelers hope that someone like Daniel Jones would do it. Again, we've heard nothing from the organization. This is just a rumor, but we are going to break down the quarterback options, and we'll come to find that Daniel Jones could be high on that list because the options are just not so limited this year. Shayne, we'll get to that in just a second. Before we do, I want to talk about the other rumors that happened these past few days. Trevor Lawrence trade rumors. Now, this is wild to me, but for what it's worth, and I'm sure you've heard by now, about the Steelers reaching out to Trevor Lawrence. I heard from a source the Steelers did indeed reach out to the Jaguars about Lawrence. The problem is the Jaguars can't trade Lawrence. He's untradeable. They would have a $203 million dead cap hit if they traded him. So it's probably just one of those conversations where it's more about, just hey, how's Trevor doing? Yeah, any interest in potentially moving on from him? How about Christian Kirk? That kind of thing, rather than, yeah, we want to go hard after Trevor Lawrence. If the Steelers did their homework, they obviously know that you can't trade Trevor Lawrence. It would probably take 4 or 5 first-round picks because of the dead money that the Jaguars would have to eat in that lucrative contract they just gave him last offseason. So he's not tradable. But for what it's worth, I did hear the Steelers reach out to Shad Khan and the organization about a potential trade there. So for what that's worth, Shayne, assuming this were something that could happen, and it won't, and Trevor Lawrence himself turned it down and basically said that he likes playing in Jacksonville. He's not coming to Pittsburgh. Would you be interested in trading for Lawrence if this was something on the table, let's say maybe down the road, or right now if you can get it to work contractually?
Yeah, just because Trevor Lawrence, for all his faults throughout his career so far, is still one of the more talented passers in the league, right? He just is. And yes, that doesn't always mean anything, but I think in a scheme like this where the scheme is really meant to kind of prop up the quarterback in a lot of ways, or ask them not to do entirely too much with the offense, it might be kind of a good way for him to kind of reset his career at this point, because I think the film on him is better than the numbers suggest, and the wins and losses and everything like that. But Jacksonville is just frankly a dumpster fire of an organization 90% of the time. That 10% of the time they catch fire. You get a Blake Bortles 2017 season. You love that. That'll happen every so often. You had some good teams in the 2000s, but this is just an organization that has struggled to consistently put it together at the right times. So I have a hard time blaming him for a lot of it. So yes, absolutely. If he was available and the price was reasonable, right, which for him is kind of hard to gauge because of the contract and the age and everything else. But if it was on the table, he's certainly better than any quarterback in this class, like his potential wise, especially. And there's a reason he was the first pick in the draft when he was taken, right? Like that's just kind of the reality of it. So if it was available, of course, I would be interested in it for the Steelers.
Yeah, I mean, had he not gotten that contract extension already and was just ready to go into the 5th-year option here, I'd be all for it. I mean, trade the draft capital and turn around and give him a lucrative contract, because nothing's more important than franchise quarterback. We've seen that. The Steelers are evidence of that firsthand. They've had top defenses. You can't win if you can't score points. You need a quarterback to score points. And so that's what the conversation comes down to. But no, Trevor Lawrence is not on the table, not a tradable player. In fact, he's probably one of the least tradable players in the league right now because of his contract situation. You just can't absorb that big of a dead money hit. So come 2 years down the road, maybe it's possible. Right now, it is not.
Yeah.
Let's move on and talk about Daniel Jeremiah. Released the second version of his mock draft, and he has the Steelers taking Boise State running back Ashton Jeanty. Shayne, last time I took a running back, didn't really pan out for the Steelers. Najee did have 4 straight 1,000-yard seasons, but you didn't get the first-round value out of him in terms of efficiency. Was very average. In fact, below average in a lot of efficiency metrics. Not all that's his fault. He came into the league with a bad offensive line that had Dan Moore, Trey Turner, Kendrick Green. It was rough. It was rough going. But even when the Steelers fixed things or tried to fix things his last few years with draft capital, just still wasn't yielding the results we had hoped for. Ashton Jeanty, very different type of player. Very, very different. One of the best running back prospects I've graded. He's going to be right near the top when it's all said and done after I finish my pre-draft evaluations. I typically, Shayne, you know that I am opposed to drafting running backs in the first round. I think that it's a bad philosophy overall. You want to have the roster building mentality where you can get cornerstone players that can be on your team for multiple contracts. The Cam Haywards, the TJ Watts of the world. Running backs typically don't fall in that category unless you pay them lucrative second contracts. And many times, not in all cases, as we've seen with Saquon Barkley, but many times running backs on their second and especially third contracts they're toast. They don't have anything left in the tank, assuming that you wear the wheels off of them, kind of like the Steelers tend to do, what they did with Najee, what they did with Le'Veon Bell before that. So having said all that, Shayne, you're still probably getting a top 5 player in the entire class. Are you on board if Ashton Jeanty falls to Pittsburgh at pick 21? Would you be okay with this selection?
I think you have to be okay with it just because of the value, because it is undoubtedly so that he would be the best player on the board by far at 21. Like if he's still on the board, there's no chance anyone else that is anywhere close to the top 5 is still sitting there. So just from a value perspective, and honestly, again, a need perspective, because we'll talk about Jaylen Warren in a second, but Najee seems very likely to be gone. Cordero Patterson could be a cut candidate because he just didn't really seem to have anything left in the tank this past season. Like this entire running back room could be entirely different, right? It's possible. And I don't think it's going to be entirely different. I do expect Warren to be back. We'll talk about that in a minute. He would be the best player on the board. Now, is it the right time for this team to invest in that position with a first-round pick? No. But at the same time, you don't run into this type of player at 21 really ever. Like this level of talent at any position this late in the draft, especially in the first round. Like you just don't often see it. So I understand the decision from Jeremiah in the situation if he were to fall all the way out of the top 20. I don't think he gets anywhere close to 21. So I think it's kind of a moot point to me at least. But if he's on the board, you have to entertain it simply because of the value.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, he's probably going to be a top 3-4 player for me in this draft class. When you ignore positional value and you just grade the prospect,
who are the best football players in the class? It's hard to argue that he's not one of the 5 best, especially.
And the benefits, Shayne, obviously of taking running back in the first round is you do get that 5th-year option.
Yep.
So you can run Genty as much as your heart desires for the next 5 years if you're the Steelers, and get him on a very reasonable contract. And especially if he ends up being one of the best running backs in the league, you've got yourself a football player. You theoretically open up a window. But I like this pick a lot better if it comes with an organization that is already a contender, one with fewer roster holes. For example, like what the Lions did with Jahmyr Gibbs 2 years ago. I think that ended up being an excellent pick. You got an explosive running back who is extremely dynamic and helps your offense tremendously. A situation like that would be ideal for Genty. The Steelers have roster holes. They need a defensive tackle. They need multiple wide receivers. They need a cornerback. And so are you willing to ignore money 5 positions to take a running back, which is something the Steelers have done in recent years, albeit for a lesser prospect? But I would be intrigued by it at the very least, Shayne. The last running back I would have considered taking in the first round for the Steelers was Christian McCaffrey, because I had that high of a grade on him that if he had fallen to that point, I would have been okay with that. And so it doesn't happen very often, but Genty certainly falls in that category. And for what it's worth, on Daniel Jeremiah's board, he has Omarion Hampton going 1 pick after the Steelers to the Chargers at pick 22, North Carolina running back. And then 2 picks after that at pick 24 to the Vikings. He has Travion Henderson going. Shayne, if the board laid out like this, obviously we won't be able to tell what's going to happen after Pittsburgh's pick, but if you knew there were going to be running backs essentially back to back to back in the first round, would that make you even more want to take Genty there, knowing that in the second round, you're wiped? I mean, Caleb Johnson isn't going to make it to that point, especially if running backs are going this early in the draft. Would that increase your willingness to draft Genty at pick 21?
Yes, if he's there, because again, like you hope that a guy like Travion Henderson and Omarion Hampton, probably not either, but you hope one of the top 5 or 6 running backs is still sitting there in the second round if you want to address the position that early, which I think is possible for this team. I don't think that anyone should discount that. You might say that's still too early, but with a class like this, and the first 5 or 6 backs are all guys who I could see being feature backs, or at least like players who are featured on your offense. You know, Travion Henderson is more of like the Gibbs type where you'd ideally not want to give him 20 touches a game, even if he's a lead back. But for the most part, the first 5 or 6 guys are guys that profile to me as like true like lead backs in the NFL. If you can get one of those guys in the first 2 rounds, and you're a team like the Steelers who clearly want to emphasize the run game, whether we like that or not is a different discussion. But if you're going to do it, this is the draft to invest in the position relatively early if you can, even though the depth is good down the board.
Yeah, I agree. And so by that, it does make sense, Shayne, to do something, because you could certainly be wiped, and then you'll have to just kind of do the running back by committee approach, in my opinion. And we'll obviously talk about the draft a lot more later on. But I've watched a lot of running backs already, quite a few hours of tape into this. Ashton Genty, I would be where I think that they should go. You should be a top 15 to 20 pick in the draft. Omarion Hampton and Caleb Johnson and Travion Henderson would be my tier 2 of running back. I think that they should all be like top 35 picks. I think that all 3 will be gone before Pittsburgh's second round pick. So, and if that happens, Shayne, then my tier 3 is kind of just Quinshon Judkins in a tier of his own, in tier 3, because then after that drops down to Dylan Sampson, Devin Neal. I don't like those guys quite as much. Cam Scadaboo, I mean, just no speed there.
He is an interesting one.
So I think that if you miss out, like maybe Judkins would be the only quality option available for Steelers in the second round. If I could tell you Judkins is there, would you rather have that in the second round, or would you rather just spend a first round pick and get the elite running back prospect?
I mean, if you can take a guy that you think profiles as an all-pro potentially, I think you have to take him at 21. It's just because, again, the running back conversation has gotten to the point where I think a lot of people have gone too far in the other direction, whereas like for a long time the thought process was, well, running backs don't really matter except for the very, very, very elite ones. And it's like, yes and no, because if you have a guy who's a true difference maker at the running back position, it just makes everything else easier on offense. It just does, because it's really easy to turn around and hand the ball to the running back. It's not as easy to, especially for a young quarterback, get the ball out to all their playmakers, especially if those playmakers aren't necessarily great, right? And right now, this team does not have great playmakers outside of, Freiermuth is debatable as far as whether you call him great, and then Pickens is great like 6 games a year. So it's kind of hard to say that whoever the quarterback isn't going to be benefited by being able to turn around and hand the ball off to Ashton Genty. So that's what it comes down to, I think. Yeah, and this is
Yinzer Joe chimes in. If you have a chance to draft LaDainian Tomlinson, you do it. And LT is like my favorite running back of all time.
As well.
Like I grew up on him. Yeah. I probably have a bias towards him, but I think you can make a case that's the best running back in the history of the league.
I would
there when he's playing at his peak.
Receiving,
rushing, his contact balance, running low to the ground. I can see some similarities in play style between him and Genty. My comp for him is kind of more of the Marshawn Lynch running style, but with more burst than that.
I was about to say, Lynch is the guy that I think you like. Ideally, that's who Genty ends up being a lot like is Marshawn, because the tackle breaking ability, the way he bounces off tackles, not to get too far in the weeds on him, but it's otherworldly, honestly, is the best way to describe it compared to what you normally see. It's certainly special for him. So
it is. Good comment there. If you guys have any other comments or questions, please drop them in the chat for us. We'd love to be able to get to those. Shayne and I love doing draft film.
Yes.
It's interesting, Shayne, to see like the guys going after the Steelers pick in Daniel Jeremiah's draft, like Emeka Egbuka goes at pick 25.
Makes a lot of sense.
Shamar Stewart would be a really interesting guy. I don't know how you feel about him as like a convert guy potentially, but
I haven't gotten an edge yet. I just started tier defensive line this week. I'm going to watch him as both because I know he has the profile to kind of potentially do both. So I still think from what I've seen, though, I lean him as more of a true like big bodied edge type, because I think he has the athleticism to stick, right? That was the problem with some guys where it's like they played edge, but like, are they an edge rusher or are they just playing edge? Like, especially at the college level. I think he actually has the goods athletically to stay at edge, especially if he keeps it around 280 or less. So,
and I think the last big thing worth noting, though, on Jeremiah's mock draft is the Steelers pass on Egbuka and Matthew Golden. So wide receiver is obviously one of the top 2 biggest needs on this team, arguably number 1. But I think that Jeremiah's logic is Genty's just too good of a value at this point in the draft. He's just a better prospect than those guys. And so that's who he has Pittsburgh going with. If you agree with that pick, let us know here in the chat. Like I said, we love talking draft. We're going to move on. Let's talk about Jaylen Warren for a little bit here. So Jerry Dulac addressed the Jaylen Warren contract situation just a little bit ago. Early on, people were talking, well, maybe he'll get the second round tender. That seemed likely. But don't forget about the right of first refusal tender, and maybe that's the direction the Steelers will go. So the second round tender, Steelers can either place a first or second round tender or original round, which they can't because he's he was an undrafted free agent. So the second round tender would give Warren a contract, a 1-year contract, $5.217 million for the 2025 season, whereas the rights of first refusal would give Warren a contract of $3.18 for the 2025 season. They would still have the right to match if somebody comes in and offers Warren a contract extension that exceeds those numbers. And so they can let some other team do the busy work and figure out all the contract details.
Mm-hmm.
And then all they would have to do is come back in and say, yes, we would agree to keep you for that price, or no, we're going to let you leave and maybe get a 4th or 5th round comp pick for you. I think the biggest risk you run with that is somebody would say 3.18. We can definitely give you a yearly value more than that. And so maybe there's a little bit more chance that they could risk losing him there. But again, Steelers would still have the right to match that offer. So I 100% agree with what Dulac said. I think the rights to first refusal is the right way to go, because if nobody comes and claims that, if nobody jumps on the Jaylen Warren wagon here, then the Steelers get him at $2 million less per year in 2025 than they otherwise would have.
Yeah, I do agree that makes a lot of sense. I think my only holdup would just be the way that running back contracts are starting to trend back up to the point where maybe a team looks at what he had been before the season, where he was more banged up this year. It was much more explosive than the previous 2 years. Do they say, okay, we can give a contract to the Steelers that maybe they're willing to match, but hey, maybe they'll just say we don't want to pay $6-7 million a year, which is, I think, reasonable for a team to offer him on like a 1 or 2 year contract. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if a team that desperately needs help at running back. You look at the Raiders, for example, I think could be in on Najee Harris as well, by the way, but that's another thing. Just teams that might need juice in the backfield that they don't have. I could see them trying to swoop in and make the Steelers pay more than they want to. Whereas the second round tender, you know at least that, the potential there would be a second round pick, if nothing else, right? So like it's a weird setup, but I do agree that the right of first refusal makes sense for this position, especially him coming off a down year by his standards. So,
and Shayne, I think that the Steelers should almost play this in terms of how much do they want to make sure that Warren is on the roster. Like if you don't want any chance
to them,
then the $2 million difference between 3.18 and 5.2 million is pretty minuscule.
Yeah.
Just give him the second round. If you know that he's going to be part of this plan for 2025, give him the second round tender. Nobody's going to go and pay a second round pick for Jaylen Warren, 26-year-old injury-prone running back. So no, so you will keep him for that price, 5.2 whatever million, or you can risk it in kind of the risk reward situation there. In the worst case scenario, somebody poaches him. He works towards your comp formula for the following season. And you can kind of just hit the reset button at running back. You can get a young, fresh unit in there, which is maybe what they need anyway. Right. I'm totally good with keeping Warren. If Warren wants to stay as like the change of pace back, third down back for his blocking ability, receiving out of the backfield, that kind of stuff, they obviously need more help there. But I would do the rights of first refusal. If it was me, I think that I would gamble and try to save an extra $2 million, because I don't think that Warren being on the roster is going to make or break you.
No, I don't think it'll make or break you either. I will say what they choose to do here might signify what they think about not just him long term, but also this running back class. Because I think if they don't guarantee he's on the roster with the second round tender, which again, for all intents and purposes, guarantees that no one's going to offer a contract to him and risk losing a second round pick. But I think it does tell you probably a little bit about whether one, they plan to add to the room with the draft relatively early, and also just what they think of him as a player at this point in his career too. So,
yeah, agree. And all those decisions have to be made by 4 p.m. on March 4th before the start of the new league year. All right, we are going to move on to our first big discussion topic of the day. It's Steelers quarterback situation. Like we said, nothing more important than that. Getting that resolved right now. We're going to go through all of the potential options right here. And again, if you guys are joining us in the live chat, please drop a comment, a question for us. Please like this stream. Leave us a comment down below to help it be seen by others. If you like this content, enjoy it, please tell others about it as well. Shayne, let's start with the free agent options the Steelers could explore. And it is a short, dry, ugly list this year. In fact, the best names on the list, the best name on the list is Sam Darnold, right?
Yes.
So Darnold, you're going to have to fork up for. Whether you like that or not. How much do you trust a guy that had one good year out of 7? It was an impressive season, 35 touchdowns, over 4,000 yards. But can he replicate that when he's not with Kevin O'Connell, when he's not with Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison? Like when you go back to a more bland run-first offense with lesser weapons, are you going to be able to be 80% of that guy, 90% of that guy? I just don't know. It's a risk. And he's going to have multiple suitors. I have no doubt he's going to have multiple suitors. So he will ultimately get to choose his destination. If the Steelers are not as appealing as some of the other teams that are out there bidding for him, well, then he's going to go to the other franchises, or the Steelers are going to have to up their offer and sweeten the deal here to bring him to Pittsburgh. So I don't think that's a likely option, Shayne, but I think it's the best free agent option overall. How would you feel about Darnold?
I think it just comes down to price and length of contract with him, because what he showed with the Vikings was clearly an upgraded version of what he's shown throughout his career. Now, again, is a lot of that due to his surrounding cast, the coaching? Absolutely it is. Like that's just reality. And that's the case with really almost any quarterback, right? Like the better your surrounding cast, the better the coaching you're getting, especially with the physical gifts he has as a thrower. Of course, it's going to make things easier for him and make him a viable starter. The issue for him, and I think what's going to ultimately make the price tag on this contract a little cheaper than anyone is expecting, is the last 2 games of the year were just too much of old Sam Darnold, despite the surrounding cast, despite the how good the team was around him. It was just too much of the stuff that plagued him throughout his career prior to this year. And that doesn't mean he isn't still a much better player than he was a few years ago, or especially early in his career. But he's not the same quarterback that I think was, looking like an MVP candidate for much of the season. Like that's not who he is individually away from this team. I don't think he's going to be an upgrade he would be an upgrade for the Steelers, and certainly one for a lot of other teams. But I wouldn't be surprised if the number in the contract is a little smaller than people think. Ultimately, it's going to be much closer, I think, to 30 million than 50 million. Let me put it that way. So it's going to be I'm going to be very curious about what that number looks like and what teams ultimately go after him too.
Shayne, logically, that makes sense. I totally agree. And Darnold was a couple disastrous performances. The last game of the season, must-win game. I mean, you're a 14-win team. That literally determined whether you get the top seed in the conference or if you have to play from the bottom up on the road throughout the playoffs. And they were one and done after that. So 2 bad games in a row. But the agent is going to argue, well, my client had 35 touchdown passes and over 4,000 yards. And if you compare that to other players with similar production around the league, this is what he should make. And so I do think, because of the lack of options, I think that there will be somewhat of a bidding war, even for this one-year wonder journeyman quarterback. So I kind of think somewhere in the middle of those two. I'm thinking closer to the 40 range per year. We'll see what that ultimately comes in at. If it's 30, Shayne, sign me up for that today. I'm going to do that. I'm going to get into my free agent budget because you can't win without a quarterback. And even if Darnold is going to a lesser situation, at least he's coming off of a very respectable year where he led his team to 14 wins. And so that's the most intriguing option. We go after that, Shayne. Here's where it gets really discouraging. The next 2 best quarterbacks on the list by a mile are Pittsburgh's quarterbacks from the 2024 season. Justin Fields and Russell Wilson, when we look at free agent options only. So Sam Darnold, Justin Fields, Russell Wilson. Are you intrigued at all to bring this unit back? Like, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over again and expecting different results. The Steelers tried it with Wilson primarily through this season, crumbled down the stretch, lost 5 games, including the playoffs, scored 14 points a game during that stretch. Obviously, you and I would both be way more apt to give Fields that chance. Can he run that offense? That's the question. Can he be consistent enough from game to game, play to play? That comes into question there as well. So Shayne, am I right by saying that you would rather have Fields of those 2?
Yeah, the amount of reasons is pretty long, but it's pretty clearly, like, if they run it back at all with this room, it needs to be Fields for a ton of reasons. And the biggest one is just the potential for any amount of upside. Again, it's unlikely that we get anything special out of Fields, but could you get a top 25 quarterback that is also due for a big game here and there because of his rushing ability? Probably. That's probably the floor for him. And that's good enough, I think, with what this team wants to do offensively. And it doesn't cost you as much as it's going to cost you for a Darnold, or probably obviously even a Wilson himself if he were to be brought back. Just gives you more flexibility for both next year and the future. And I just think he's a better player at this point, frankly. He's a more effective player is a better way to put it. But
yeah, I 100% agree with that. I can't go another season with a 37-year-old Russell Wilson after it lives and dies by the moon ball.
To a ridiculous degree. It's actually
got really skittish in the pocket. Yeah, it's not going to get any better, folks. He was on a veteran minimum contract, $1.2 million. He's going to be 20 times that on his next deal, and he's going to be older and 1 year closer to the end of his career. That's the second and third best option. Here's where it gets nightmarish. If you have to dig down to this, now you're already looking at the Daniel Jones, Jameis Winston, Zach Wilson, Andy Dalton, Marcus Mariota.
Well, Dalton's back with the Panthers, 2 years, $8 million. So good for him. Dalton's back.
That's
Panthers,
right.
Yeah.
Trey Lance. These are bad options, Shayne. And so I feel like of the free agents only, Sam Darnold, Justin Fields, Russell Wilson, and then there's almost nobody else. Daniel Jones. I mean, we talked about that already, how we feel about that. Where would you go? Like, would you even sign any of these free agents to be anything other than a backup for you?
Other than like anything more than a backup, ideally, no. I mean, I'd have some interest in like a Brissett because of the veteran presence there, and I think he's shown enough as a quarterback in this league that if you give him an offense that isn't super complicated, that is going to do a lot of things for him and make things easy on him, he'd be okay. You know, I think he's better than like a Rudolph or something like that if we brought him back as like a backup stopgap guy. Like, there's guys here who have NFL experience, who started games, who could probably win games for you if you needed them to, but you don't want them to be the starters. Like maybe a Mariota, he had a good year backing up Jayden Daniels. I think he goes back there, frankly, though. I think he's a good backup for him. But like these are all guys that aren't starters in the league anymore. They're guys, or maybe never were really, but they're guys who can at least play enough to probably get you a couple wins, but you need to have someone else installed in front of them as a starter.
Yeah, if your goal as a Steelers fan is to finally get that tank season and be able to get a quarterback without a big trade up the following year and be entertained at the same time, then you can go with a Jameis Winston or a Zach Wilson. But I don't think it's going to be good enough to compete. And so realistically, Shayne, of the ones that we've seen so far, all these free agent quarterbacks, I think there's only 3 options that could lead you to the playoffs. 4 if you count Daniel Jones, and that is it. Like that's
being generous, though, too.
That is being generous. That's likely 2 of these guys would end up leading you to the playoffs. All right, what
question? Yeah, it's good question actually here. So real question: say Fields goes to New York, which I have been hearing that with the Jets. Do you want Wilson or Vanilla Vic Daniel Jones? Man, that's like asking me to like choose between stepping into traffic or something. Yeah, anyway, no.
I've got an answer. I mean,
honestly, I do too, but I'm curious if it's the same as yours.
All right. Well, let me share it. And if you guys can yell at me here in the chat if you don't like it, I think it's time to kind of bite the bullet and have the bad season. I'd rather have Zach Wilson. I'd rather sling the ball with Zach Wilson, who at least has a huge arm, was in a really dumpster fire. Are you talking about Zach? Or are you talking about Russell?
I didn't get
it first.
I think
okay. I'd rather have Zach Wilson than either because
that's really funny.
We've seen Russell Wilson and I would rather just have the bad season at this point. And if Zach Wilson is good, well,
that'd be hilarious, but also
maybe you get like a 24, 25-year-old quarterback who's got really good tools. If he's bad, which I expect him to be, you are in a position, you bit the bullet for 1 year. You're in a position to get a franchise quarterback next year. I know it's not a popular take among the fan base. I know everybody's about trying to keep that winning record season alive. Just do anything you can to get to the playoffs. To me, Shayne, it's not about anything you can to get to the playoffs because there are massive tier gaps of talent in this league and massive tier gaps of quarterback play. And if you have one of the bottom quarterbacks in the AFC, you can't expect to go anywhere in the playoffs.
No.
You just can't. And so I would rather roll the dice with a more polarizing quarterback. And if he figures it out, maybe you have something there. If he doesn't figure it out, and I wouldn't expect him to, then it's probably best for the state of your franchise, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, that's the rub with, and I've talked about this a lot on this show and other places. It's tough for me to talk to friends of mine who are like fans of teams that are just terrible, and then them like complain about how terrible their team is, then me to come on here and be like, man, the Steelers could really use a bad year. It feels bad to say it because it makes me feel spoiled as a fan because like it could be a lot worse, right? Like this team is always playing games that matter to some degree late in the season or in the playoffs, and that is something that a lot of fan bases don't have. But the problem is you can only take so many years of it being the same thing before you start to go a little crazy, right? And I think a lot of Steelers fans have reached the point where they're like, they kind of just can't see the light at the end of the tunnel in terms of this team actually becoming something different. And at some point you want something different. It doesn't always matter if it's good or bad, but it needs to be different. Zach Wilson would certainly be different. I will give you that. So I understand the thought process there, but we know that Mike Tomlin probably thinks Zach Wilson shouldn't even be playing football. So, that's probably
No,
it's
he
like
is
his
the last
least
type
favorite type of quarterback. Yes, least favorite type of quarterback.
Yes,
So yeah, I
for
don't see
sure.
that coming.
So all these free agent options are just terrible. And to speak on that, one final point on that, Shayne. Yes, the Steelers have had a winning record, that they've been in situations where they've made the playoffs, but since 2017, I have never felt like this team could go anywhere in the postseason, and they haven't, because you can kind of just see the way things are unfolding. If you play a super conservative style, if you can't score points, it's not going to work in the postseason. And I think that they just need to do more at this point. We've been stagnant for so long. Do you want to go a 9th season without a playoff win? That you might have to in order to get better. Like sometimes you do have to get worse in order to get better. So I disagree with a lot of folks in Steelers media when they say that you don't have to get worse before you get better, because this team has shown they have not been willing to trade up. Even Terry Bradshaw, they were a bad team when they got him. They were a bad team when they got Roethlisberger. The year before, they were a 6-10 football team. And fortunately, in a historic quarterback class, not the third best, but the third quarterback prospect in that class fell into their lap with the 11th overall pick. They just happened upon him. Other than that, the Steelers haven't traded up. They were willing to let Kenny Pickett fall in their lap and just take the first quarterback that came to them. I hope this front office would be wiser than that and more aggressive, realizing the importance of the position. Like if you have to trade 3 first-round picks to get a quarterback, that's what you have to do today in order to get your franchise back on track. But yeah, that's all that's to say it's probably time for that. Anyway, free agent quarterback options are very, very bad this year outside of Darnold and maybe Justin Fields. And I don't think anybody wants anything else of that garbage group, because you're going to Russell Wilson or to Daniel Jones. And we've seen Russell Wilson. We know who Daniel Jones is. Let's move on to the potential trade options, Shayne. And I'm going to keep this to just realistic trade options, because we've talked about some out there ideas in the past. 2 weeks ago, we talked about Matthew Stafford, and I think that there's a faint chance of that, but just it doesn't make logical sense to me why McVay and the Rams would do that when he has at least a reasonable deal. They can kind of let him just ride this out off into the sunset here before they move on. They don't have a backup plan in place. They were a good team this year, so they don't even have a pick worthy enough to get one of those guys. So I'm going to talk about the 2 options that I think are actually realistic candidates. If the opposing team decided to move on from them, they could actually make it happen. You're not going to like the first one because I've mentioned his name in the past, but Derek Carr is the first somewhat realistic trade candidate. You've got a new coach in the building. And so would they be willing to move on potentially, because the Saints could try to reset their franchise? They're in a bad way financially. They could try to get out of some of those contracts and kind of just hit the reset button, give Kellen Moore a chance to do things his way there, instead of just rolling with the veteran that's in his mid-30s now. For the Steelers, it would make at least some logical sense, because I think Carr would be a good fit with Arthur Smith's offense. I think he's more willing to throw the ball over the middle of the field than the quarterbacks the Steelers have had. He doesn't always make the most big plays, but he is an efficient quarterback at the very least in terms of passer rating. He always hits the 7 yards per attempt threshold, which, heck, I mean, we know who Carr is, but 7 yards an attempt, sign me up for that compared to what we've seen in recent years from these quarterbacks. It's just not very good. So is that something, Shayne, that you would have any interest at all? And let me give you the contract details here. Carr has a base salary of $30 million this year, a roster bonus of $10 million. His guaranteed salary is going to be paid by the team. And so he would cost the Steelers $40 million and maybe a 3rd-round pick. If the Steelers were to go get him, you could have him over the next 2 seasons if you want to extend him beyond that, which I doubt you probably want to. He's going to be a stopgap quarterback for 2 seasons, and maybe you even have to rework his 2026 numbers and add on a void year or something that way. But for $40 million, is Derek Carr enticing to you, even in the slightest, Shayne?
I think that I would rather pay Sam Darnold like $60 million a year to play quarterback for the Steelers than do that. To be fair, Derek Carr is my least favorite quarterback to watch in the sport that actually plays and actually like sort of is like not bad, just isn't like he might be the least interesting quarterback to watch play football. Let me put it that way. And I know that doesn't necessarily matter in terms of like whether he should be playing or like whether he'd be an upgrade for the Steelers or not. But I simply don't think I could watch this man play every week for this team, despite the fact that I cover the team. I think I'd have to like really try hard to watch every game. Like, also, I'm pretty sure George Pickens would rage quit in the middle of the third game of the season if he played with Derek Carr. Like, I think that's also something that would happen, which for some people that they might say that's good, but then his trade value probably gets tanked. So then he kind of sucks either way. But no, it's too much money for a player that plays like him. It's too much draft capital, even if it's only like a third round pick. I'd rather wait for them to decide to cut him or something if you're going to ever entertain him being on the team. So that's just where I'm at with him personally.
I get not being interested in that. I think the situation would have to be pretty significantly better than what it is. Maybe half the cap number coming in and less draft capital. Like if we're talking 40 million and a third round pick, like that's too steep for me. 40 million and a fourth, you can intrigue me into it probably enough. And again, my whole thing, Shayne, it comes back to, we talk about windows all the time in this league. Cam Hayward turns 36 years old in May. TJ Watt turns 31 years old early in the 2025 season. Your window really is now. Like, and if it's not now, then you need to look years down the road and say, all right, of these guys we just drafted in the last 2 seasons, that's going to be the future of the team. They're not ready yet, but eventually that window will open back up again. This window right now, as you have your 2 best players in their final years, or at least Hayward's final years for sure, Watt's final good years where he's playing at a really, really high level, you need to do something. And I don't really care if you get a 34, 35-year-old quarterback right now, because the window's going to line up anyway. Carr's window will line up with those guys' window, assuming he was good enough to get you to the playoffs and win playoff games. I just think that Carr is going to be an underwhelming option when you look at all the quarterbacks in the AFC. And so it's hard to argue that he would be anything better than like the 7th or 8th best quarterback in the conference. So you have to hope the roster talent around you is good enough to make up for that. And I just don't know if it is at this point. So in my opinion on Carr, if it was a little bit less there, maybe 10 million fewer on the cap number and a later round draft pick, I could get behind it. The way it stands right now, I think I would have a tough time getting behind that. I'm more behind it than what you are, Shayne, but still not an overly intriguing option. So if you ranked Carr, Shayne, among overpaying for Sam Darnold or paying for Justin Fields and Russell Wilson, is that the dead last one, or would
that would be dead last?
Okay.
For sure for me, because of the opportunity cost factored in there too. At least with like Wilson and Fields and Darnold, like you don't have to actually do anything except pay them money, and especially in the case of Fields, less money than you'd be paying Carr. Probably the same thing with Wilson too at this point, because I don't know how many suitors he's going to have, but it's a lot of money and capital for a player that I don't think is an upgrade over that type of player.
Gotcha. So. And of the other names that we've talked about so far, would he be the 5th option over Daniel Jones?
I mean, again, the problem is that you're not going to have to pay any of the other cheap free agent options, right? Like, so if you're going to spend a lot of money on a quarterback, you at least better take a shot at the guy that might have the potential to actually do something, which is Darnold. Maybe Fields, that's still, up in the air, but at least he's going to be cheaper. Like, that's the thing. I think the upside versus the opportunity cost just doesn't work out for me with him.
All right, Shayne. I get that for sure. I would take him over Daniel Jones, because Daniel Jones to me
he's a better player than Daniel Jones, obviously.
What Derek Carr is. I can't stand to watch Daniel Jones. So that would be the worst form of torture if I had to go 17 seasons of a Daniel Jones. So you brain dead pocket presence and no big plays down the field.
Interesting.
Which Carr's, I mean, the no big play thing, he replicates that. But
the problem for Carr is actually so much that, like, and this is what frustrates me with him, is he is capable of throwing a great deep ball. He just won't do it unless it's specifically like it's the only throw there is to make. Like, if you call a deep shot and it's the only thing he can do, he will throw it. If you don't do that, he's looking for that check down. He is waiting for it to be a check down, it feels like. So it's very weird with him, but it is what it is.
Yeah, I agree. Of those options, you guys, if you're in the chat here, list those options in the order that you would take them. Darnold, Fields, Russell Wilson, Derek Carr, and Daniel Jones so far. And I got one more for you, Shayne, and this one you are more on board with based on our previous conversations. That is Geno Smith.
Yes.
Now, again, the Seahawks would have to be willing to turn the page on him, but I think it would make a lot of sense because they could save $31 million by trading Geno Smith. With that money, they can go out and get a Sam Darnold. Now, they would have to have that assurance that they have their quarterback before they go and trade Geno. But the cap number would be very reasonable for the Steelers. You're looking at like $31 million is what the cap number the Steelers would have to absorb this year. And the Seahawks would be able to save money that they could jumble all that $31 million and put it towards a quarterback of their choice. Now they have Mike McDonald in there, and maybe they want to turn the page. Maybe they think that things are kind of stale with Geno at this point, and they want to move on, or just get out of him before the last year of his deal while they can still trade him for something. Is that an option, Shayne, that you would go with, and where would you rank that among the names that we just mentioned?
I think of the names that we've mentioned, he's the best player that's available. Okay. And I understand Sam Darnold had a better season than him last year overall. But if you ask me, like, regardless of situation, right? Because obviously Sam Darnold's situation is much different. As much as that offense is very good with Seattle, they had a lot of issues with interior offensive line. The right tackle spot was a disaster. There's injuries, right? Like the whole thing was kind of a jumbled mess at times. But if you ask me which player would I trust to lead the Steelers specific roster into the next season, it's Geno by a pretty wide margin for me. And I think he doesn't get the respect from a lot of people that he deserves, honestly, as a player at this point in his career and what he's done to get to this point after having a really rough start to his career. He is the type of player that I think if you're trying to maximize this window, he's the only one outside of Stafford, which again is probably a pipe dream for a lot of reasons. If he does get traded, I don't think it's to the Steelers, for example. He's the best player that's available and the only one that might be able to get you beyond just a playoff appearance to me. So this is the move I would make if it's available, which I don't think it will be. There's just not a really easy out for them in terms of like getting the next guy. Like I don't think Sam Howell's the guy for them. I know they traded for him, so there must be some level of interest there from them, but I don't think it's enough to hand him the starting job. The draft is in a position where they're not going to be able to get one of the top two guys. So unless they love one of the guys beyond that, that doesn't really work for them. It's just a weird situation for them to trade him. But if he's available, I would certainly be on the phone.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's an unlikely trade because they just don't have that next plan in place. They don't have enough, a high enough draft pick to go up and get the guy they want. Now, could you put that $31 million towards the Sam Darnold? Sure, if Darnold wants to play there, if you think it's an upgrade for that system. Contractually, though, this one actually makes the most sense of any of these starting quarterbacks now to trade because they can actually save a lot of money where pretty much everybody else is taking much bigger dead money hit to trade their quarterback. All right. The other one, we're not going to get deep into the weeds with the draft options because we basically know that there would be two of those guys. The Steelers would probably have to trade up. We'll talk about the draft quarterbacks more at a later date.
Yeah, later time,
but the Steelers, either way, Shayne, they're not going to go into April's draft without having this quarterback situation.
I sure hope not.
They're going to have somebody.
Hope not, or else they're not going to risk it. Yeah, we're really in for a ride if that's the case.
Oh, man. If you are a fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers and would like to support the Still Curtain podcast, please consider subscribing to the Still Curtain podcast on YouTube. We appreciate all of your support. All right, Shayne, I'm excited for this. We're going to list in order, beginning with 5 and counting down to number 1, our way too early predictions for the Steelers' first-round pick in 2025. We've covered this team a long time. We know their draft trends at this point. We've got a great idea of the positions that they will be interested in, even this early in the process. Heck, we could have told you that in November or December, what positions the Steelers would be targeting. And so I think there's a reasonable chance we could nail this pick with one of our players that we mentioned here, Shayne. So we're going to start in reverse order, and maybe we can come back and check on this to see if we got these right. And we'll start with your list. Now, again, just to preface here, this is going to be Shayne's predictions of who he thinks the Steelers could draft, correct, Shayne, in the first round, and from least likely to most likely of his top 5 candidates. So, Shayne, go ahead and give us who your 5th overall candidate would be.
For me, the 5th candidate is Walter Nolan, the defensive tackle out of Ole Miss. We'll see a lot of these guys, like as far as how we track who we think the Steelers are most interested in, we won't know a lot of the metrics for a while, like pro day visits, going to see them, meeting with them at the combine, all that type of stuff. But Nolan was at the Senior Bowl. Steelers were focused on that defensive line group a lot. There's going to be a lot of Senior Bowl guys that are going to be tied to them. Nolan is the best of them that fits that mold of what they're looking for in the defensive interior. They need a lot of help with that spot. We've talked about that as one of the biggest needs on this team. He has a lot of juice. He has the pass rush ability that you want. He played the run very well for a guy that came in at 293, I think, at the Senior Bowl. I think he's going to play it probably closer to 300 once we get to that point in the league, but still a more balanced player than you'd think for a twitched up athlete like him. And the reason I have him fifth, though, is I do think I've heard some character stuff. I know you've talked about it too. Like, I wonder if that might make them shy away a little bit. So, especially because they seem to only not care about that with receivers for whatever reason, but hey, whatever. But he's a guy that I think is going to be on their radar at least and kind of see what that looks like throughout the process. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should say too, Shayne and I did not share notes at all before. I have no idea what his list is. So Shayne, we can keep going right down your list, or we can bounce back and forth. Which do you have a preference?
I think it'd be more interesting to see, like, go pick by pick with each of ours, like, so you're least likely next here and kind of see how those line up with each other. So,
okay, well, believe it or not, my fifth most likely candidate to be drafted by the Steelers at pick 21 is Walter Nolan as well, and I went for him for similar reasons. Now, I think the Steelers could potentially shy away depending on how concerning the character issues are. And I have heard some things from the coaching staff.
Yeah.
So at Ole Miss, dealing with Pickens these past 2 years, I think it could be a huge turnoff to the Steelers.
Potentially.
The talent is so good.
Yeah.
He comes at arguably the biggest position of need, and the Steelers were run on for 299 yards in the playoff game against the Baltimore Ravens. We know they have recency bias. We saw them after they were a poor rushing team in 2020. They went out and spent a first-round pick on Najee Harris. So they've got recency. Art Rooney has recency bias as much as anybody, any owner in this league, and he's got a say in what this team does. He will push them in a certain direction. I think defensive tackle is high on their radar. Nolan is one of the few guys that I think that value truly lines up for where the Steelers are picking. And you can argue that they're getting a top 10 player, even in this class, at pick 21, if he were to be there at that point. But the character stuff could force them to shy away a little bit. But I also have Walter Nolan, Ole Miss defensive lineman. His film is really, really good. If you haven't watched it, to me, he's like a 90% of Jalen Carter. Like, that's just the way that he plays football. He's much stouter against the run than his weight would suggest. He's good against the run and
really good play strength for size. Yeah.
All right, Shayne, who do you have at number 4, most likely way too early first-round pick for the Steelers?
So this one I wish I could put higher, but I just don't know yet if it's going to be the player that they want to target at this position group. Because I have, just as a sneak peek, I only have 2 position groups in this top 5 players. I think that there's 2 I'm kind of focusing on at this point. So we'll see kind of how you differ there. But my number 4 player is Matthew Golden, the receiver out of Texas. He just fits the profile of the type of receiver that I think that they're, 1, missing in the offense, and 2, the type of player they were trying to acquire over the past 2 years, right? The route runner type that has smooth athleticism, who can win down the field, is good after the catch. Like, that type of player that is really kind of the opposite of what we've seen a lot from George Pickens, right? Because whether he's on the team or not, they want to have those contrasting skill sets, have guys who can do different things. And I think that was kind of the thought process with Roman Wilson. Obviously, we'll see what he looks like. Is he just going to be a slot player for them anyway? That type of thing. Golden, though, profiles to me as a true outside receiver that can be a number 2 or even maybe a number 1 if he keeps developing. He is my actual number 1 like outside receiver in the class for me personally at this point, potential-wise especially. So he would be a guy that I hope they're interested in, and also does make a lot of sense fit-wise.
Okay, Shayne, I am on a little bit of the same wavelength as you, except my number 4, most likely first-round pick for the Steelers, as we do this 2 months before the draft, is Luther Burden.
Yep, he was a name I wanted to think about too.
The reason I have him at 4 and not any higher on this list is I think there's a reasonable chance Burden is gone before this pick. What he offers after the catch is very impressive. I mean, he's an A to A+ type player with the ball in his hands after the catch. Very twitchy, pretty rocked up, can run through arm tackles. So I think the Steelers are going to be very intrigued by that. SEC guy, had a really good season in 2023, although his production dipped obviously last year. Quarterback play played a factor. Just this morning, I went and rewatched every snap of Burden from the 2023 and 2024 season, every target, I should say, from Burden. And he is a very impressive football player. The reason he's not higher again is because I think that there's a better chance than not that he's not available when the 21st pick in the draft rolls around. But same type of thing, Shayne. I think the Steelers are really going to be focusing in on two positions here in the draft. I don't think that that's hard to see for anybody that's been paying attention. All right, Shayne, your number 3 most likely candidate for the Steelers in the first round.
So this one is also partially for the same reason with Burden, where you have him a little bit lower, because I think there's a chance, despite the position he mostly plays, this guy could get pushed up the board a little bit because of just how freakish he is for the type of player he is. I have Kenneth Grant out of Michigan as my number 3. He's a nose tackle type, which his team desperately needs and hasn't had for a long time. He's going to be close to 340 pounds. He's a freak athlete. I think the reason why I wonder if he's going to go a little higher than he's being projected now is you look at, and I don't think he's necessarily has the upside, obviously, of this player, because I don't know if any nose tackle in the history of the sport has the type of upside. But you look at what Dexter Lawrence has been for the Giants, right? Freak athlete, huge player, the best pass rusher at nose tackle, I think, already in the history of the sport. I don't think anyone who's primarily a nose tackle, or at least spends a lot of time at nose tackle, has ever been the pass rusher that Lawrence is, especially the last couple of years for him. I don't think Grant has that level of pass rush upside, obviously, because it's just not fair to ask a nose tackle to have that type of pass rush upside. But he has the athleticism to potentially be an impact pass rusher from that spot while also being an impact run defender. So I can see him going before them, but I think he's the type of player that they need along the defensive line, and the fit and talent would line up at 21.
Okay, yeah. I'm not going to give any spoilers yet, but what's my number 3 most likely Steelers candidate is Matthew Golden, who you had a number 4. Very easy to get behind him. I think for the Steelers perspective, you look at a guy that can run routes, catch the ball in traffic, sideline ability, everything he does. He's just a natural receiver. I kind of likened him to Jordan Addison a little bit. Maybe doesn't create as much space as Addison, but I think he's even tougher at the catch point than what Addison is. And Addison ended up being a good pick. I think you're probably getting a number 2 receiver, but one who can man that X role for you if you need him to. And they desperately need that type of receiver, someone who can slide into that Deontay Johnson role and somebody who can be the go-to target for this team. I think that he can do that, maybe not at a high level in the NFL, but at least as a very solid wide receiver in this league. So that is my number 3, Matthew Golden. Shayne, we're back to you with your second most likely Steelers first round pick as we do as we do this exercise months before the draft.
For me, it's Emeka Egbuka, the receiver out of Ohio State. I think he personifies everything that the Steelers need at receiver, outside of the fact that he's probably best in the slot most of the time. But I think he can step outside. I think he has enough juice to be an outside receiver, at least some of the time, right? And I think they need somebody who can be a target hog, like somebody you can pepper with targets, somebody who's going to do the right things. He's going to block for you. You can hand the football in the run game on sweeps, do that type of stuff. Not trying to give anybody PTSD about the jet sweep, but you can do that type of stuff with him. Like you can do a lot of things with him in the offense, and he's going to be a plus at really any position he's playing for you. And with him, he's the safest pick, I think, at receiver by a mile, just because of the experience he's already had at Ohio State for so long. Ohio State's leading receiver all the time. Now, granted, a lot of the reason for that is because most guys don't stick around for all 4 years for them because they get drafted very high. But still, he's been as productive as anybody that has ever come through that school. He just kind of hits every nail on the head that you want, and he's a guy that you're confident is going to make good on the pick, if nothing else.
Yeah, Shayne, for the same exact reasons, I have Emeka Egbuka as my number 2 most likely first round pick for the Steelers in this April's draft. I'm really interested to see where you go now with this number 1 pick, because I was kind of thinking in my head before this exercise that he would be your number 1. He just checks so many boxes. I think Egbuka is a B+ at everything he does. He may not wow you, but like you said, he is incredibly safe football. I think he's one of the safest prospects in the entire class. You look at his volume production over the past 4 years at Ohio State. Was a highly recruited guy. He's supposed to be a good athlete. He can play in the slot, play outside. He's really tough. I think in the right situation, you got him in the right scheme, he could play that. He could be an Amon-Ra St. Brown type
That's the
player
very
for
high
you,
end
or
comp
JSN
for him. Yeah.
So I think most likely, more likely JSN than St. Brown, obviously. Probably not going to be the 1,400-yard receiver. A lot of the production matters where you go. Are you playing second fiddle to somebody else in that offense? Where the Steelers, I do think that even if Pickens stayed and you drafted Igbuka, there's a chance that Igbuka is your number one actually go-to target. You could pepper him more
target-wise
because of his route tree, more so than Pickens. So I'm a fan of that selection. I think that it's a really, really safe pick, but you're also hitting like a double or even a triple with that selection, because if he ends up being your number one wide receiver in your offense, I don't think he's a number one type in the NFL, but in the right scheme, used the right way, he possibly could be. So that's mine, Shayne. And back to you with your most likely pick for the Steelers at pick 21. Who is that?
This might be a little bit of a surprise for you and for people, and there's a reason why, and I'll explain more specifically once I name this player, why I feel this way. And I think once Tomlin and the staff get their eyes on this guy, if they haven't already, they're going to potentially feel similarly. I have Derek Harmon out of Oregon, the interior defensive lineman. Okay. He gives me major Stephon Tuitt vibes, like major Tuitt vibes. As a guy who's a full-size player with athleticism you shouldn't have at that size to be able to rush the passer. Most productive interior pass rusher in college football last year from a pressure standpoint. He wins very routinely in the inside as a pass rusher. His size is good enough at about 310, 315 to still be a great run defender that he was in Michigan State prior to transferring to Oregon. Put it all together in his final season there. And I think, again, when you look at what this team needs on the interior, they're hoping to find the eventual Hayward replacement. Like that's what I think they're ultimately looking to try to do. Have a player that can do everything for you on the interior. I don't think at this point, at least I'm getting through some other interior guys, but I don't expect any of them to supersede him here. I don't think anybody is as balanced a player at both running or against the run in the past the way that Harmon is. He's going to end up probably as a top 15 player for me. So for me, I think that if they see him similarly, Tom's gonna be like, yeah, give me that guy, because he reminds me of a guy that I wish was still on the team right now. So.
I love Derek Harmon, and I love Stephon Tuitt. Like that was one of my favorite Steelers of all time, because awesome I thought he was so criminally underrated.
He always was, yeah, he always was.
But in Harmon, I was very, very close to putting Harmon in my number 5 spot over Walter Nolan and kicking Nolan off my list. My number 1 spot goes to Kenneth Grant.
I figured, yeah.
And the reason I feel like is almost slapping us in the face. This team got run against for 299 yards. The Steelers will have in the wild card game. The Steelers will have recency bias towards that. Their run defense and their front 7 kind of collapsed down the stretch. They can't have that identity. I know that Rooney won't stand for it. Tomlin won't stand for it. Terry Lawson's going to want to fix that. The Steelers rushed over to the defensive line group at the Senior Bowl, to no surprise. It was a talented group there. Grant wasn't there, but they've got their eye on defensive tackle. That is for sure. And there's a reason why, Shayne, both you and I had only interior defenders and wide receivers, because they're going to draft one of those positions. And
I think so.
Unless there's an oddball pick like an Ashton Genty or a guy that's just too good of a value they can't pass up, I think it's a very, very rare case. But otherwise, I think they're going with one of those 2 positions. And honestly, I think because of how things line up, and I know that this is a deep defensive line group, but if you have a chance to get a plug-and-play starter who can be better, make your defense better instantly, I think Kenneth Grant is that guy. I think it allows you to take Keanu Benton out of the nose tackle position and play him in something that's going to be better for him, because he is a much better pass rusher than he is a run defender. That's been glaringly obvious. If you're able to do that, you plug a 340-pounder in there like Grant, who can still move laterally, very impressive movement skills for a guy his size. I think it makes
watch him for those at home real quick. Watch highlights of him and just watch him at times appear on the screen out of nowhere. And you're like, where in the world was this guy coming from? His speed at his size and ability to pursue running backs down the field to the sideline, it doesn't look right, frankly. Like if recency bias gets me Kenneth Grant, I'm all right with that. Normally, they overcorrect a little bit too much. If that's what they need to do, they think, I'll go ahead and give that the thumbs up. Him, Harmon, really any of these interior guys, especially at the top,
Yeah.
I think are well worth the investment at 21. So.
Yep. So there you have it. Derek Harmon was Shayne's number one most likely pick. Mine was Kenneth Grant. Interestingly, we both had a defensive tackle, not a wide receiver, being that number one most likely player for the Steelers. We'll see if that changes, and maybe we'll even do this exercise later on.
Sure
Shayne, I'm excited to get dive into some mock drafts. We did live mock drafts last year, so definitely stick around with us for that. But when we do this show this time next week, we will be doing an NFL Combine primer as we get prepped for the primer starting next Thursday. And so we thank you for following us on the show today. We go live on this show every Wednesday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern time. Also check out Josh Yoris's show on Mondays at 1:30. Thank you for joining us on the show. You can follow Shayne on X at Shayne Kubas. You can follow me on X at Tommy Jaggi. You can download the Still Curtain podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and also check us out on YouTube or ask Alexa to play the Still Curtain Steelers podcast. Thanks again for listening to the Still Curtain podcast.